So, who remembers that Saturday Night Live skit? The Mrs. Wagner. Good morning, class. Good morning, Mr. Wagner. Yeah.
Two handles or one hand?
Okay, so
Huh?
Sarah's death
Okay.
and burial. So
Okay.
I'm curious, who here, this is not their first Torah study cycle? By a show of hands, whose this is?
Not.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So, hon, what's your name? I don't know that we've actually formally met yet.
Me?
Yes.
Dawn.
Dawn?
Dawn.
Like the sunrise dawn? Okay. So this is the first time that you're actually going through a one of the Torah cycle?
Yeah, I started last week.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Well, welcome. All right. Well, then I'll try not to botch this up too bad. Actually, it's funny because I was talking with Johannes at the gym yesterday, and I had a couple of questions because so since I started teaching this, which has been pretty new, just this last year, it seems like for the most part everybody in here has been through at least one cycle of this before. And so whereas I want to do the study justice by talking about the stuff that's important, or that I'm sure that you all talked about before in the study, those of you who've had me know that I like to do things a little bit differently. So there's a couple of things in here that I don't know that anybody's gotten into with you guys as far as sort of things that are in the text or topics that I was hoping that we would spend a bit more time on rather than just the sort of the nuts and bolts of the study, if you guys are following me. So, okay, Genesis chapter 23. Find my notes. All right, so before this, did anybody actually have any questions in regards to the 23 through 25? Any glaring big things jumping out to anyone? They were like, I really want to talk about this at the study on Saturday. Dawn?
I'm not sure there's really much to talk about, but it just kind of glared at me and shocked me because I didn't expect it. But like when Abraham dies and they bury him, it says Isaac and Ishmael. And I was just like, when did they get back together? It's just
Right.
like I thought, once Hagar and Ishmael were banished, basically, that they were just never had to do anything with Sarah's side.
Right, in the story, they were out of the story for good.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's neat. I guess, I don't know, Isaac must have texted him or something, told him that, yeah, interesting to think like how news would travel around then. But apparently Abraham was a person of some renown in the region. And, like some of the discussions later when he's talking about purchasing the tomb for Sarah, they're like, Lord, what's it to you? And Emma, you did this one last year, right? I think I was in here, or I was part of you. We were talking about Abraham and sort of, I don't know. I think it was you. For some reason, I'm picturing your face and having this discussion. Or
Probably.
Brought up. But yeah, apparently he was well known in the region at that point. Not just with the locals, but it seemed like on a larger scale. I guess than we think. We think about like that this was so primitive, from the movies and all that, and just how people dressed and they're riding around on camels and stuff like that, and that it would take forever for news to travel. But I guess that's not really so much the case. Okay. So yeah, we are gonna talk a little bit about that. Anything else? Any other big things that were on people's heart to get into?
Well, just in the first portion I'm going to get into, the favor that was shown to Abraham was kind of struck me.
You mean with the locals?
The locals and the kings that he approached to purchase the land,
Right.
and everything that they threw in along with it,
Yeah, no, it is. It's
They gave the prime location.
yeah. Well, last year when we were talking about this, Emma, in your experience, is that really the case?
That they gave him the best,
Yeah.
or that it yes and no, I would say. Because of course the whole thing is, it sounds very generous, right? That they're like, you can have anything you want, right?
Right.
When he's approaching these people and wanting, but Abraham is adamant about purchasing the land to bury Sarah.
Right.
So the question has to be, why is he so, like, if they're willing to give it to him, why is he so adamant about purchasing it?
Right.
And it seems to be that it's because he needed a guarantee that something wasn't going to happen down the line. He needed a right to the land. Thank you. Sorry.
Right.
And so there's that aspect of it. And then actually something I was reading this week that I don't know that I had thought about is as much detail, is that but Abraham was also wise in what he was asking for, because he was asking for a space on the edge of the land,
Right.
so that he wasn't going to have to go through or in the midst of these people to access it. So it's a little bit of a mixture. Like it seems like a little bit of like I think that the people that he's talking to, the kings that he's making this deal with, are trying to serve their own interest and trying to extend something so that there can be a decent relationship while also protecting themselves in the future, which is why Abraham then is so adamant that he's strategically picking this edge piece of land and requiring that they accept payment for it so that they can't take it, they can't do something weird in the future. So it's a little bit of a mixture, I think.
I mean, he wants a deed.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, where the local Hittite or whatever courthouse was near there where they would file this paperwork, or how all this stuff worked. But he wanted legal rights to it so that this couldn't turn around later and just sort of be forgotten in the annals of time or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, we had given this to this guy, right? So you think about, I don't know. I guess sometimes when I try and picture this, I have to remind myself. So based on Dawn's question, like we think about how this stuff appears in the movies, right? And Abraham's out there and it's like, this one measly tent or whatever, and he's got his small family. He was a company of people.
Mm-hmm.
This was no small thing. Like Hillary.
Like a city in and of itself.
Yeah, it was like it was a traveling mob. Maybe mob might not be the best term for it, but he had fighting men and servants, and this was when they moved, it was no insignificant thing, So you have this traveling city, kind of, right on the border of the promised land, right? So the people there are not thinking that, this is just, this lonely old guy and his, his poor deceased wife or whatever. But there's a troop moving, and so it's interesting. Like we need to sort of bring in the other what we've read and everything before into the picture now. When we start thinking about what this sort of looks like.
Yeah, and just even which is plays into what we're talking about as well, is like that people would know who he is, because it seems he's quite wealthy, which means he has a lot of livestock and a lot of things, which requires then a lot of people to care for them. So that so it's definitely it's because I think we think it's like it's Abraham and Sarah and they don't have any children, so it's just them and this little thing, and it's like actually no.
Well, I'm thinking back to a couple weeks ago when Lot and his family got captured, and it said, now Abraham heard his brother was taken captive, so he armed his 318 trained servants.
Right.
So he's got a core group of 318 trained military men.
Yeah.
And that's their role in his company. And there's 318 of them. So.
Yeah, so think about
And
that.
they've each, I'm sure,
two
got a
guys
wife
to a tent, four
and
guys to a
families.
tent, whatever. They moved, the people around knew it.
Yeah.
So, to have a dedicated force of trained fighting people, so this wasn't like the cooks or the laundry guys or the whatever. He had his own company of soldiers. So yeah, it just like I said, when you read it, oftentimes it's easy to forget like sort of the big picture about what this stuff looked like. You know, when you're talking about like Israel moving through the desert, you know, 1 million plus people or whatever. And I think of the logistics of you know what that entails to move. Where's everybody go to the bathroom?
Right.
Let alone feeding that many people and watering that many people and everything. Anyway, I don't want to get too far, but yeah. Yes.
Well, and again, this wasn't like, he wasn't purchasing this as a place to settle. He wasn't looking to plant crops. He wasn't, this is a purchase place for a burial place where people keep going back to be buried here. So he's looking for a cave. I mean, it's like, he's not like, oh, give me this city or we're gonna settle here. This is a spot, a dedicated spot that we're gonna see throughout the storyline. People keep going back to this location to bury people.
So he
And-
purchased a graveyard.
Yeah, he purchased a graveyard, you know, so to say it's prime real estate, you know. I mean, the location of it's unique. The fact that it was purchased is very important. But it was for a specific place. It wasn't to settle as they moved around. It was a spot to continue to go back to for that very purpose. And so to me that's just like a really, you know, if you've ever had to go and pick out a burial spot or pay for a burial lot, I mean, you get a deed for that too. I mean, Stan and I recently did that just so our kids didn't have to. It's so weird to get a land deed for a spot you're being buried in.
Right.
But it's ours and nobody else can be buried there.
Mm.
You can't build Starbucks
Yeah.
Aw.
Good. We don't need any more Starbucks.
Yeah. Although I have to confess I like Starbucks. But anyway. Yeah, so it's interesting. So this sort of him purchasing this foothold into a land that God promised him, right? So, right, the Lord said, look at this place, you see this, this is gonna be for you and your descendants forever, right? And then, you know, your descendants are gonna be as, you know, numerous as the stars in the sky, and we start combining different things. So it's interesting, like when the Lord promises something, that requires a partnership between us and him. It wasn't like Abraham said, okay, well, the Lord promised me this, so I'm just gonna sit down and wait for this to happen. And someday, poof, the Lord's just gonna plop this whole, you know, stretch of land into my hands. Like it's a partnership between us and God. Always, always, always a partnership. There's stuff that he says that he's going to do and stuff that we're required to do, or we have to play our part in it, right? So I just thought that was kind of interesting. Like, yeah, this is God partnering with him. And the Lord didn't say, oh, by the way, you're going to have to spend some money to buy a piece of this land that I'm promising to you and your descendants forever. And Abraham didn't take the guys up on their offer to get it for free, thinking that, oh, well, God promised this to me, so sure, I might as well take it for free. He was insisting that he paid for it so that the whole thing was legal and binding and generational, the deed for the graveyard. So yeah, it's just interesting when we kind of look at it that way, like, huh, grandma.
There's another little thing to this. These people were Hittites, and they end up being one of Israel's enemies. So if Abraham had taken their offer, for one thing, Sarah would be buried in land that was Hittite land. Therefore, and it was borrowed, it wouldn't be his. So I think that this was God leading him to purchase land that would eventually be the state of Israel.
Very good. Okay, well, so we kind of answered that. My first question is, what was the significance of Abraham buying the land and not just taking the sons of Heth at their offer? We doing okay with all that so far? Okay. So interestingly enough, so if somebody volunteered to go to Luke chapter 16, verse 9. First one there gets to read it.
How much do you want read?
Do 7, 8, 9, 10.
Of chapter 16, correct?
Yes, please.
7 through 10. Okay.
Yeah, a little context.
All right. Then he said to another, "Now how much do you owe?" And he said, 100 units of wheat. The manager said to him, "Take your bill and write 80." Now the master praised the crook manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the sons of the sage are smarter when dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. I say to you, make friends for yourselves from the wealth of the world, so that when it runs out, they will welcome you into the eternal shelters. One who is faithful in the smallest matter is also faithful in much, and the one unjust in the smallest matters will likewise be unjust in much.
So this is Yeshua, Jesus, relating a parable, right? And about using, can you read verse 9 one more time?
I say to you, make friends for yourselves from the wealth of the world, so that when it runs out, they will welcome you into the eternal shelters.
Anybody ever mulled on this one before? This is kind of one of those where you read and you're like, what is he talking about here, using worldly wealth to sort of buy friends and being welcomed into, what's the exact verbiage?
Eternal shelters.
Yes, eternal shelters. So, yeah, I see a couple of, yeah.
Not what you know, but who you know.
Right, and just and the idea of this sort of mixture between earthly things and heavenly things being mixed, being used one for the other. It's yeah, I don't know, as I was reading this, that's what popped into my mind. I was like, I wonder if there's actually a connection there between Abraham using some of his earthly wealth to end up making a purchase into something that was promised from God as an eternal promise. This is going to be the place for you and your people forever. Again, I don't know. That was just, for some reason, this is what popped into my mind when I was going through it, and I was like, okay. Any thoughts on that?
Prepper language?
Hmm?
Prepper language?
Abraham was a prepper. I like him even more.
I don't see anything revolutionary about it at all. It's very common human wisdom.
Okay.
I kind of think of it too as like, it kind of is a little bit of the, how do I say it? It's the idea that it's like, when you follow the Lord, you let him use all that you have. Like, and maybe you're even like, it's a little bit, especially in this Luke 16, it's like maybe some of this wealth was accumulated not in the most righteous of ways. And yet the Lord's like, but it can still have clearly eternal consequence, eternal benefit even. And with Abraham, I think it's like, it seems he was already wealthy when God called him, when God made covenant with him. And so it seems very much of like, and this was, in the ancient world, this is your thought, is like you use what you have to serve whatever God you serve, right? And so that's in some sense, I think it plays into that, this is what Abraham is doing. It's like if he's following Adonai, then all of his resources are a part of that,
right?
And so, and I think it also is a good lesson is that the Lord needs people to be wealthy sometimes. Because there are some people will have this wrestle or this thought that to follow the Lord, you have to give up everything. And some will go to the extent of choosing a life of some form of poverty for that. And I'm not necessarily saying that God doesn't necessarily call some people to live that kind of life that's totally reliant on the Lord providing for everything. I'm not saying that he doesn't do that with some people, but he also uses wealthy people to expand the kingdom and to do a lot of great things. So I think we have to so I think it's good to see that the Lord works through that. He's not, like, it doesn't seem like they're saying either of these of like that it's sinful for these people to have wealth,
Right.
even if it wasn't necessarily gained in the best way,
Right.
which is interesting.
It's true. It is. It's true. Brad.
So, just to kind of dovetail on that, I think in using your wealth and your resources for the Lord, the Lord doesn't need our resources, but our neighbors do.
Right.
And so, so by doing that for Him, you're doing for your neighbor. You're loving God and loving your neighbor, and so you're using those resources, and so you're building relationships and you're blessing people, and so the Lord is working through you to bless your neighbor with your resources. And He says in Matthew 6, do not build up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, nor thieves break in and steal. And so what are treasures in heaven if not the relationships that we've established here on earth? And so in that way, He says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of worldly wealth. So use that worldly wealth that you acquire to establish those relationships and to bless people that's setting up your treasures in heaven. And to tie that back to Abraham, that, what is that saying, where commerce flows, tanks do not, or something like that? It's a modern saying, so like if there's commerce between two nations or two states, then there's not war between them. Or it's, and when one dries up, then when commerce dries up, then the tanks come in. And so in that way, the Hittites were an enemy of at the time. And so by doing this transaction, that's setting up a relationship, whereas, then it'll ease any tensions because now they have a relationship.
Right. Bought and paid for. Yes. 2 questions. She beat you, Hillary. Go ahead.
In the scriptures, money is referred to as mammon, which means
Can be.
unrighteous. And so, if you use money in a righteous way, in works that last, then that's a blessing.
Mhm.
But money can also lead to selfishness and unrighteousness and evil living. So, people today don't say mammon. Money is kind of glorified, and you're looked upon a wealthy person. You become, somebody important if you have money. But actually, in God's eyes, it's not so.
No, you have the perfect examples in our society nowadays. You have wealthy actors and actresses and people like that who have a lot of money, and now all of a sudden they're experts on politics, geopolitics. They have something to say about everything, and no one questions you. At least I've never seen it questioned, like, I don't know, like Whoopi Goldberg. She's an actress, yet she has all this stuff to say about politics and all this, all these other things. And it's like people are just like, oh, well, this person's wealthy, so what they say must have some credibility. Or all these actors and actresses, they become activists or whatever, and everybody just listens to them, and they're in the news all the time, right? Oh, this person, you're an actor or an actress. What makes you, have anything valuable to say about geopolitics and, all this other stuff? It's just, it's interesting. Well said. Hillary.
I was just thinking back to the Abraham's desire to have this land purchased, and then also the example from the king of Sodom saying, "Here, go ahead and take all of the plunder that you were able to capture as you rescued our city," as a way of saying thank you I'm not going to take a single item because I don't want you to be able to say that you made Abraham rich.
Right.
I want people to know that my prosperity came from the Lord. And that could be that same line of thought in this opportunity as well, to say, I don't want people to be able to point to the Hittite nation and say, they made Abraham wealthy, or the promised land came through these people. I want it to be through the Lord only.
Well said. Anything else? Okay, well, we'll move on. Chapter 24. So this one. Why is placing the hand under the thigh, or actually genitals, a thing? What's the significance in this? So the scripture says, right, Abraham's talking to his servant, right? He says, they're getting into a covenant. He's making him make a promise, and he says, put your hand under your thigh. So actually, I did a little bit of research. Have you guys touched on this one in the past studies a little bit? Okay, so from what I found, this wasn't. If you're picturing like, oh, he's lifting up his leg and he's having him put his hand underneath his thigh. That's not what was going on here. Okay, he was by the kechuffles. He had him. He put your hand underneath my testicles. Okay, so we're swearing by people's private parts here. Is there some significance, or is this just a thing that they did? Could you imagine if business deals were still made like that today? I don't know. There'd be a lot less business deals, I think. Just signing contracts, but yeah. Why is this a thing? Is it just a custom, or is there some significance to it?
My study Bible said something about that it was kind of a common practice for that day and age in that area as a form of submission.
Okay.
That's all I remember. I didn't bring my study book,
Okay.
but it was just a form of submission and a way of acting on this person is over me.
Yeah, could be. I did not come across it in my reading, but I'd be curious as to who was the submitting part, the grabber or the grabbee. But yeah. Well, what's the significance of the male's genitals in this?
He's swearing about generations. I mean, he's talking about take a wife for my son Isaac. So he's like swearing by his seed, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it seems to tie together. I don't know how to say it well, but yeah, he's swearing by his seed that he will get a son or a wife for his son Isaac, and he will continue his generations. And it seems to be a generational allegiance or swearing, and doing it on the seed. There seems to be some significance to it.
Yeah, those were the things that came up. This has to do with the foreskin, or in Abraham's case, the lack thereof, and seed, the future. We're making a covenant that involves future generations of his people, and how all this was going to end up, with Israel and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I don't think that it was just sort of like a local custom or something that was done, at the time, but that this is actually another thing where we're relating a physical thing into a spiritual thing, and the ramifications of both. And really, this is I don't know. I think maybe in modern or Greek worldview, right? We like to separate the physical from the spiritual, right? They're like two independent things that actually don't touch one another, don't have anything to do with each other. Like I studied philosophy in college, and so this whole the idea of sort of the physical realm and the physical body being inferior to the invisible, to the spiritual one, and that I don't think that that's really supported in the Bible. that one is necessarily better than the other. It's always been about the two worlds coming together. We see that back in the garden, and we see that all the way at the end of the story. And all throughout the story, there's all these instances where the two things are brought together, the physical and the spiritual. And what we do in one has an effect on the other, and what happens in the other has an effect on the one. So we shouldn't, I guess I'm just encouraging us to kind of try and think more Hebrew when it comes to this stuff, which is going to require some, doing some research on your own part, and not just looking at the scripture, but especially when you run into stuff where you're like, not really sure. I know that there are definitely times where you have like a reading schedule where you're reading where you run across a bump in the road or something you're not really sure about, and you kind of just move past it. But I'm also a huge proponent of when you reach places where you're like, to park there for a while, meditate, seek the Lord, do some research, do some homework, look into, sort of what the ancient Hebrews believed in regards to the matter, what the understanding was. Then helps to stop making the blunders of replacement theology or misunderstanding text or not connecting old and new and seeing the continuity with all of it. So, common theme with me. Any other questions or comments on 24? Yes.
One comment. With the different levels of the different ways that people interacted with each other, with whether it's making covenants, making promises, submitting to staying in someone's house by driving an awe through their earlobe, with a covenant, whether it's a covenant that we have to sacrifice an animal for. Right before this, the pledge of the land, all it says is it was in their eyesight. But we see these different levels, which I believe has a great deal of significance to the extent of the severity almost of the relationship. When somebody cut a covenant or made a promise, sometimes it was speaking it forth with their mouth, but sometimes there was physical actions that needed to be done in order to totally commit to that promise, that covenant, whatever it might be. So yeah, on this one, obviously, this was, if I remember correctly, this is the same man that when Abraham went before the Lord and he said, I have no descendant, do I give it over to this person?
Right.
So there is this obviously an extremely unique and personal relationship between these two men. And this gesture, this action is showing that he is so committed to making sure that Abraham's seed goes forth in a non-cursed, because if we remember, the Canaanites were cursed. The seed can't go through there. And so that commitment level there of I am completely committed to making sure that your seed carries forth from a people group that hasn't already been classified as cursed, that is of your family line. And I will also, part of that promise he made was that he would make sure that Isaac didn't leave the land, because he could have left the land and that would have ended this whole scenario here. So this went even beyond, I'll bring you a wife, I'm gonna make sure your son stays put too. And that obviously wasn't a tension there. So yeah, I see these levels of these physical gestures of commitment to things. They all seem to be significant within the realm of what these promises are.
Well said. Yeah, on a little bit of a lighter note, when someone's got you by the, you take it pretty seriously. Okay, so here's what we're getting into, sort of the fun part for me. But okay, let's see. In chapter 25, Abraham takes another wife, right, has children and it lists them, but eventually ends up sending them away. Why?
Where does it talk about him sending them away?
So let's go to chapter 25. Right at the beginning, Abraham again took a wife, and her name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimram, Jokshan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Then it says sort of who their descendants were. Abraham gave them all, and Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But Abraham gave gifts to his son, to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, and while he was still living, he sent them eastward, away from Isaac his son, to the country to the east.
I got a little confused there. It says he took another wife. And it says she bore these. Then later it says the concubine.
Right.
So is she a concubine or is she a wife? Or is it the same thing?
If you're the woman, I think it would be important for you to have the differentiation, but I don't know. It is a good question. It popped up on my radar too, but I was like, I really don't know what to do with this.
Yeah.
So I kind of left it alone.
There's been other times where they intermingled the two. When Lot was in Sodom, I remember they're talking about concubine, but also talking about as his wife. I don't know exactly, but I know that's not the only place they talk about both.
Yeah. Well, it comes up with Jacob too.
Yeah.
His 2 wives and then the 2 maidservants who are also wives but not. Like there's mixture. There's some kind of gray area there too.
Yeah, I guess
So-
I kind of wonder if there's something to do with like status, in the household, or maybe decision making rights. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I'm really not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in this situation. I think it's interesting because it seems that he takes Keturah as a wife after Sarah. That's how we understand it.
Right.
So that makes it a little bit interesting, but it does seem that there's something different about her. Like she's not quite the same as Sarah.
Right.
So yeah, there's some mystery here, but one of the commentaries that I was reading this week was talking about that some of this may be even showing some of the additional fulfillment of, you'll be the father of many nations. So that's another possibility. I didn't follow that stream of thinking, but I thought it was an interesting perspective. So I'll just put that on the table. You can think what you want with
It
that.
sort of popped to me too. Like,
So yeah, it is a little bit confusing, but it does seem that that she's not quite the same as Sarah.
I think I must have read this differently because they've got the wife Keturah, which they named the kids, and of course Midian, which is where Moses' father-in-law came out of. But then he says Abraham's concubines. So this could be additional women that had additional kids that just aren't listed because he didn't marry them. They were even more people here. So to me, I saw the significance of after Sarah died, he took another wife. These were her kids, but then it also seems to me like he had concubines on top of that, and they had kids. And to their son, those. So basically, he gave gifts to everybody that were his sons, but he still had to make sure, which is the same way Ishmael was sent away.
Right.
He still had to make sure, though, that the seed promise remained here with this one son, and we can't start having this land divided up against these other nations that are being born through here. We have to keep our focus on this specific seed, the son of promise
Right.
on this. And yeah, he's the father of nations. So I think that's where I just saw, yeah, he had another wife, he had concubines, he obviously had a lot more kids, he gave them all gifts, but they had to stay separated from Isaac, which could also kind of meld into this loneliness that you kind of feel like he has throughout these chapters. He just seems like a really lonely kid.
I mean, any of the other children are also a potential threat to Isaac. So the fact that, I mean, it speaks to Abraham's generosity, right? He's like, okay, well, yeah, you're my kids too, so I'm providing for you, right? A righteous man provides for his offspring as best as he can, right? So I see that as part of it too. Like he's not, he's also making sure that they have something to walk away from. But now here, again, centuries later, we see that the animosity between all these various descendants from Abraham, there's still jealousy. There's problems. Big problems. So anyway, yeah, just stuff to think about. Mom?
Sarah remains the wife of status, and her children were the only ones that were sons of promise. So that was separate. So anybody else after that Abraham got involved with were not wives, were concubines. They were secondary. And a concubine is secondary to the wife. So these sons that he had with the concubines he built a nation or nations that came from them, but they were not the sons of promise. So the only ones that really counted in the Lord's eyes, because he was going to use them, were the sons of Sam.
Well, towards that promise, I don't know that I would say counted. I don't want anybody to think that we're being dismissive
Well,
of them. I know that you're not saying that, but I mean, it's like,
I counted only in that the sons of promise.
Right.
They were separate.
Mhm.
That's all.
Yeah, as it relates to the land and the promise that the Lord made. Yeah, I mean, clearly God cared about the other descendants that would come through the other lines, like Ishmael and these other children as well. So, yeah, I know I don't hear you saying that. I know you're not saying that. I'm just, for the studio audience, or if anybody's out there watching this online or whatever, I don't want anyone to think that that's how we feel, like, oh, these people are just, God doesn't care about them or anything. I know you're not saying that. I'm just reinforcing that. Okay, well, here was the part that I was hoping that we would be able to spend a little bit of time on, and we're running out, but I'm going to go there anyway. Okay, in chapter 24, verses 6 through 8, Abraham said that he's talking with his servant, with Eliezer, right? And he says, he will send his angel before you, when he's talking about having Eliezer go to the family. So, but there's no account in the scripture saying that an angel went to Rebekah or went to the family and sort of prepared the way in the physical for this thing to happen. Yet Abraham was confident in Adonai, was that he was going to send his messenger before. And I don't see this, I'm not looking at, when it's saying angel, I'm not saying like, oh, it's just a messenger, because angel can be translated as messenger, right? Like he's sending an angel. I'm imagining this is an invisible being going before. And what does that have to do with this? And then, so it seems to me like Abraham trusts that God's will is going to be accomplished no matter the plan. Like the Lord's will is going to be accomplished. But so Eliezer makes this request, right? How do we explain or understand this request, this prayer, and how it worked out exactly as he asked? Okay, so it almost seems sort of prophetic, right? Eleazar's making this very, very specific request that God would prosper him and that the specific set of events as a sign would happen. So he goes there, and exactly what he says, what exactly his request is what happens, right? Hey, let this series of events happen. He goes there, and that exact series of events happen. Did the Lord take away people's free will in this? How is the Lord involved in this? Who's being influenced by God here? Eleazar in his request for a sign and that things would go this way? Is Rebecca being influenced as she just happens to do exactly what it was that Eleazar requested of the Lord? Like, what invisible influencing is happening here? Is there any, or is this just complete coincidence that it just happens to work out exactly the way that?
What do you mean by influencing? Can you clarify that?
Well, okay, so I don't know, I'll try and put it in another example. So I say, you know, Lord, I feel like I'm supposed to bless Hillary Wilson with money so that she can take her family on vacation. But I'm only going to do it if when I walk into congregation on Saturday, Hillary walks up to me and says, boy, it sure is a sunny day out today, and I brought this, I have extra donuts, would you like one? So what happened here, what exchanged happened in the invisible in this instance? Was it just complete random happenstance? Was it coincidence? Or what was the Lord's involvement in this that it worked out that way? Russell?
I would have to say that the Lord was in agreement with his request, and so he granted it.
Okay, I like that.
I think it may show that the servant's faith in the Lord was maybe not as strong as Abraham's. I don't know that he'd had as much experience with the Lord proving himself to be faithful to
Okay.
his promises, the way that Abraham had to have his faith tried and tested to that same extent. And I think he's honestly really afraid of failure.
Okay,
For his master, he's kind of been given a job that he feels is impossible. He's like, number one, how am I going to find your family in this land? Number two, how am I going to convince some man to give up his daughter to me, who claims to be a servant of Abraham, to go marry a man that she's never met or seen? I don't know. I can just sense his anxiety of like,
okay.
this is a really bad plan. Like, whose idea was this? That's great that you trust this God of yours. I haven't had that kind of personal experience with him, and this seems really impossible. And he even asked for a way out. He said, if I do my very best, but nobody wants to come with me, can I be released from this promise?
Right.
He doesn't seem like he's really confident that this is going to work out.
Interesting. So do we know, was Eleazar Jewish? Was Eleazar, he would have been circumcised, right?
Yes.
Well, I think another,
Was Jewish even a thing at that point?
I would say no, but
Mhm.
but Abraham is referred to as the first Jew. That's a whole thing.
Right.
But I would suggest, along with what Hillary's saying, which I think is true, is that Eleazar doesn't have the same personal experience with the Lord, regardless of being circumcised, regardless of being in Abraham's household and being probably the closest person to Abraham in his household, because he's being given this task.
Yeah, he's
and
his man.
he's going back to what you were saying earlier, that he's the one who Abraham is like, am I supposed to give all my inheritance to him because he's, so he's playing an important role. But I think what Hillary's saying is important, that he still doesn't have the same personal interaction with the Lord. But I do think this is an interesting example because in 24:12, as he's going, he does have enough, I don't know if we call it faith or at least enough desperation, maybe.
Okay.
I don't know. To petition the Lord for this to
But
go well.
You see, he invokes the name of his
Yes.
master.
Yeah.
To the Lord.
Yeah.
Right, which I think is significant as well, because it's like, so what I would say is maybe a positive on the side of Eleazar is that he may not have the trust in the Lord, but he knows that Abraham does, and he has some level of fear, trust, probably, for Abraham.
Right.
And so he's like, Abraham has sent this to me, so I'm calling on Abraham's God, because Abraham's the one who's going to come after me if this doesn't go well.
Right.
So I'm suggesting that, again, I think that his motive is largely out of fear. But he is still like, okay, if this is all what Abraham says it is, and this is all from the Lord, then I need to call on Abraham's God and tell Abraham's God that I'm with Abraham
Right.
so that he'll listen. So it's so, but I think there's something significant about that, is that sometimes when you're like, I think that we all have maybe, or at least some of us have probably experienced a time when it's like, we don't understand something about the Lord, but we know someone else who does.
Right.
And so that person's faith can help us get there. Does that make any kind of sense? I'm not making this very clear. I don't feel like,
If my God is the same God as your God,
right.
why do I come to other people for prayer, for
Right.
healing, or for something,
Right.
when he's the same God and he
Yeah.
hears my prayers and knows what I'm asking for, yet will still go to another person to ask
Yeah.
their intercession on our behalf
Yeah.
for a thing.
And we're also in a time period where the faith and the belief and the righteousness, the whatever you want to say, of the head of the household has a level of covering on the rest of the household. So I think there is a piece to where Eliezer knows that he's covered by Abraham's faith on some level, even if he doesn't understand it, and he's still operating out of fear, like you're saying. Like, I think there's a lot of like Eliezer's like, this is impossible. I don't understand how this is supposed to happen. But he's also, again, going back to what you're saying, is like there's also this, like, the physical and the spiritual are completely intertwined in the minds of the ancient people. And so I would suggest that Eliezer has no problem believing that God can intervene and do something, because that's the understanding is that that's how the world works.
Right.
Laura's got something.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got here the first time what we've just read, where Abraham's talking to him. He will send his angel before you and take a wife for my son from there. But then we jump over to verse 40, where now we're getting basically how Eliezer saw it, what he heard, which actually expounds upon it, because then he says, so he said to me, Adonai, before whom I've walked continually, will send his angel with you, and he will make your way successful. So this is now how the servant heard it. We have the first phrase where how Abraham said it to him, and this is how the servant actually took it. He expounded on it. He's saying, Abraham walks, I see him walking continually before the Lord. I mean, Abraham didn't say, hey, I walk continually before the Lord, so therefore he's going to do this for you. But you now have the perspective of both the person speaking and the person who heard it. And to me, because he added on to this, that Abraham walked continually and that he would make my way successful, that's what he heard. This is going to be successful. Why? Because Abraham walks continually before the Lord. So if Adonai said he's going to send an angel, he's going to send an angel. That's kind of how I felt like by the time he got there and he's telling the story, this is pretty planted in his heart that this is how it's gonna go.
I tried to look. I started going to Apocrypha, and I got a freebie for you guys before you all go for what I learned from that. But I started looking to see if there was any more insight into. So did an angel actually show up to Rebecca and say, "Hey, this guy's going to show up tomorrow, and when he does, this is what you need to do." Okay, so this is all going to work because I got this great husband for you, and so if you want to marry this cool guy, then you need to do what it is that I'm telling you to do. So I wasn't able to find any insight into that, but I didn't get a chance to go look through all of Jasher and all of Jubilees and all these other books to try and see if there was any additional insight given. But I was just wondering, how sort of this worked in regards to that. But clearly the invisible and the visible are definitely in conjunction here. They're working together to accomplish this. Hillary. And Dawn, did you have a question as well? Or?
Not a question. I was just going to I was kind of leaning toward what Lori said was, I didn't get the sense of fear. I got the sense of reverence. And it says in the beginning of 24 that the servant, he is managing all that Abraham owns. So he knows and he sees the blessing and favor of God over this man.
Right. Reverence and fear are two things that kind of go hand in hand with each other. We can expound on that, but Hillary, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that what ended up convincing Rebecca was the testimony of this servant.
Mm-hmm.
I think his testimony of coming with doubts, but seeing Abraham's God provide for the situation really struck her as, wow, this is like a divine moment. I can feel the presence of things aligning that humans couldn't coordinate on their own into alignment. And it also seems like the Lord is taking advantage of all of those specifics that the servant has been listing off, kind of maybe out of fear to make sure that it's exactly right. I think he's taking advantage of the servant, even in those petty offerings of, hey, will you show up and meet me here? He takes advantage of the opportunity to meet him there, and it really impacts the servant because it says, before I had even finished speaking in my heart, there she was, exactly, like I hadn't even finished articulating all of my specifics of what I wanted to see happen, and yet there was the woman walking out all the specifics that I hadn't even finished listing. And it says his response was he bowed his head and worshiped the Lord. So I think it was a moment for God to come in and create a personal connection or relationship with this servant. So it seems like he had maybe a conversion moment, and it sounds like he was sharing this with Rebecca's family. And I think for Rebecca, his testimony is what convinced her that this is the hand of the Lord is on this situation, and I should follow through with it.
Good insight. Yes.
But if all this were a foregone conclusion, why is there a verse 8?
What is verse 8?
The woman's not willing.
So why an out?
Yeah.
Why the possibility for an out? It's a good question.
It may be
Did God need the out, or is it us that needs the out?
It may be that Abraham and his servant would never commit to it unless there was an out. I think Abraham was confident. He had had enough trials with the Lord to know, look, the Lord does what he says he's going to do. But I don't know that the servant was confident in that, so maybe it was just to be able to get the servant to commit to it. I don't know.
Doesn't out prove free will?
Oh, Mike, go ahead.
Who in your right mind would take that job if you didn't have an out?
Yeah,
Come
there
on.
you go.
This is a
And
businessman, contract guy.
Right. I mean, you have
like,
to think,
yeah.
if this servant was managing the household, what kind of mindset did he have about life? Probably similar to my life, right?
I like plan Bs.
Yeah.
At least having a plan B for mostly everything. So I get it. We like a plan B or an out if our plans or whatever it is that we're thinking falls apart or doesn't look
If
exactly how
what was
it's supposed to.
guaranteed you have absolute faith in falls apart, then you have the out.
Yeah,
Well, I do that with my kids all the time. They don't always know how much control there is over a situation. They're like, well, what if this and this? I'm like, fine. If this and this happens, we'll do that. But I know there's no possible way it will happen. But it makes them feel more comfortable.
yeah. Again, I don't think the out is on God's part. I think the out is like, how are we hearing? You know what I mean? There's always questions that it comes to us. I think that's probably why my name's not written down in the Heroes of the Faith part. Okay, where it's talking about, it's like, you know, and all these guys did all these things. Well, my name's not there, and I'm pretty sure none of yours are too. So, yeah, it's this the walk of faith thing, but yeah, I like Plan B's, just in case. I don't think that the Lord has a problem with it. I really don't. I think that He knows that we're just dirt, and you know, He's willing to work with what He's got. So, okay. So here's we're past time. So if anybody's got to go, I'm just going to throw this one at you. But if you guys want to sit and talk about it a little bit, we can. So, verse 7, chapter 25. Abraham dies. What does gathered to his people mean? What is that? Is that just a saying? It makes me think of even the Norsemen, my wife's people, the Vikings, right? Valhalla, and I go to the halls of my fathers where they're waiting for me, where they're all drinking and doing all whatever it is, the sort of their mindset on it, right? But and gathered to his people. So what was the understanding? Like, what did that mean? What were they thinking? Sheol, Abraham's bosom, where is he going? So what popped to me with this was John 8:56. So if we turn to the book of John, chapter 8, verses 48 through 59 is where this can be found, where Yeshua is having a discussion / heated discussion with the Pharisees, right? And he says to them, Abraham was glad to see my coming. And they're like, ha, you're not even 50 years old. And you're telling us you knew Abraham? And he says, before Abraham was, I am. There's no account in the Bible says that Abraham was taken like Enoch was or like Elijah was while he was still alive. We read Abraham died and was buried in the same tomb as Sarah was. So is it just a saying, or is it implying more? Yes.
Idea. This is why Abraham bought the land that he bought. So Abraham was buried with Sarah. So now Abraham goes with his people. He started his tribe, his genealogy, whatever, with the purchasing of this burial ground, where this ground became his place.
Right.
So all his generations after that, the sons of the concubines and whatever, were his people.
Sure. Yeah, no, I
Your
so
children
I
will be
agree.
your
So you're
people.
talking about the thereafter. I came of it from the understanding of it was talking about from there before. And it could be all inclusive. I don't know. Again, this was just a thought that I wanted to throw out for you guys to consider. Like, what was the understanding here?
Also because the Lord separated Abraham from his father's people.
Mm-hmm.
So Abraham became an entity on his own. I don't know, I'm not using the right words.
So that in your understanding, the God taking Abraham away
Yes.
from his people. So when it's saying gathered to his people, it's not talking about his ancestors, his father, and his
No.
father's father, and all those other people.
No.
It's talking about from there forward. Huh, that's interesting. I totally did not consider that.
Abraham's father was a God worshiper.
Yeah, he was an
Abraham
idol
was
maker,
not.
right? Yeah.
See, and God made a covenant with Abraham, not his father's people. So
So okay, I get it. I see where you're coming from. Like I said, I didn't look at it I didn't see it that way. I was looking at it more like,
Well, you should have called me.
yeah, I don't know, guys. It's just like I said, something to think about here, right? Especially as I was reading this, what popped was John, where Yeshua was talking about, hey, wait a minute, Abraham saw all this. So it's clearly talking about things that are going on in the invisible, on the spiritual realm. Abraham is not the dead, right? God is the God of the living, not the dead. So clearly there is this understanding of the spiritual world and the people who have died being somewhere where they're a witness to the things that are going on in the natural, in the physical world. Okay. Again, we can go all over the place with this, but
And also, it's not just Abraham, but it is God separating a people from himself, starting with Abraham.
Yeah.
God
Interesting.
of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we are of that.
Yes. All right. So this officially ends here, but I'm going to throw one thing at you guys. So as I was reading through Jubilees, I started reading Jubilees, looking for some additional insight into this, and I had only made it like the first 3 chapters, so I didn't get far. It talks about creation, and it sort of expands a little bit on some of the things that were going on during the days of creation. However, I've always suspected that animals could talk. And in Jubilees, it says that Adam and the animals all spoke with one tongue, and that they could understand each other, which helped me to understand a little bit of how no adequate helper or no animal was found to be a suitable helper for Adam. Anyway, I thought it was cool. I was like, did C.S. Lewis read this, or did God give him some insight or whatever? But I knew animals could talk. I keep trying to get mine to talk, but they won't